the future of Africa, it looks very bad. And it's all very well for the United Nations organizations. They're really good. They're great. They do wonderful work. But we have a collapsed international order. That's why we've got these wars, this horrible war in Europe.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. This is Regina, and I'll be your host. And I'm accompanied with Peter and Paul, as always. And tonight we have a very pressing topic, hunger in Africa. So I'll be speaking about three countries in particular on the continent. And these include Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. And while these three countries make up 2% of the world's population, they comprise 70% of the world's most extreme food insecure people on the planet. Again, 2% of the world's population, but 70% of the world's most food insecure in the world. And in fact, it's so insecure that we have various organizations that are calling for urgent action in East Africa. So in this region, there have been 3 major droughts in the last 10 years. So this is where we can speak to actual climate change contributing to this hunger. And of course, it doesn't rain, but it pours. So not only have there been these 3 major droughts in the last 10 years, but there's been swarms of locusts. Starvation on a biblical scale, really. But I'm going to talk about the 3 C's as well that contribute to this horrible mass scale of human suffering. And of course, we cannot talk about hunger in Africa without talking about conflict. So we have conflict, climate change, and COVID, 3 C's. So we know what's happening with the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And of course, these 2 countries produce a tremendous amount of the world's wheat and grain. As a matter of fact, 25%. They have historically provided 90% of the wheat that is imported to the East African region. So you have that is completely upset. Add to that climate change. Of course, that's what we're all about here, climate change. And again, we have these major droughts, and following the droughts, the locust. And as a matter of fact, they're suffering the longest running drought of the last 30 years. And then of course, there's COVID and COVID-19. I'm not sure where all of you are watching from. I know we have a lot of you in US and Canada, UK, Australia. And now if I've missed any places, please put it in the comment. We love to hear where you're from. But we all have seen price increases related to COVID, supply chain shortages. And that's for those of us, and it's caused difficulties in our lives. But can you imagine what it's like for people in these countries? We're just getting by every day. Having potable water is so incredibly difficult. So not only are prices up everywhere, but countries such as the ones I mentioned in our audience, we're tending to sort of turn inward, not be so charitable as we have been in the past with our food supplies. So that is a compounding factor. And over 14 million people across Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are already on the verge of starvation. 14 million. About half of them are children. And it is said that that number will rise to 20 million by September of 2022. Even if the rain does finally come, we have to understand that as soon as rain falls, it doesn't mean that food is ready. It takes a long time to grow and cultivate food and get it out there and distribute it to people. So it's very difficult what is happening. It's very difficult, the challenges that Africa is facing. And absolutely unmistakably, climate is compounding this tremendously. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Peter, because I know that hunger is definitely a topic that you're heavily keyed into.
Yes, thanks, Regina. And I think the first huge, terrible statistic is that hunger is on the rise again. It has slowly, over the past 10, 15, whatever years, been declining due to at least some international effort. But over the past 3, 4 years, it's increasing again. And that's been attributed to climate change, specifically climate shocks in the world generally. So I want to give a bit of a plug to a book, if I may. I'm just finishing a book by Bill McGuire. He's an emeritus scientist in UK, and it is an extraordinarily good book. It describes very, very well what's happening in the world as a whole and the trend that we're going to have to face. Now, I'm looking at a map right now in front of me, and it's a map from the NOAA's Integrated Drought Center. And yeah, the Horn of Africa is still in severe drought, but it's by no means restricted to the Horn of Africa, although there are 37 million people, according to the WHO, facing acute food shortage in the Horn of Africa. But there's a huge expanse of drought going right across Africa, going right across Central Africa. That's not only affecting the countries, the people there, but it's affecting the extremely important Central African tropical rainforest, which looks like it's switched or switching to a carbon source instead of a carbon sink, like Africa. And it's a major, major rainforest in the world. And this drought also goes over to the other coast, to Nigeria, for example. There's a lot of people, hungry people, affected by drought in Nigeria and countries around there. It's a very sad reflection that, we have tens of billions of dollars of money available for sending armaments all around the world. But every week I read an appeal from the United Nations Food Agency, appealing for money for the people in the Horn of Africa. And they're still appealing because they don't have enough. So we have a bad situation, yes, but the international order, if you want to call it, the state of world ethics, I would describe it at, is in a very, very sorry way when I'm reading that like every week.
Agree with you so much, Peter. I was just reading an article in the New York Times that 100 Americans, I'm not sure exactly who they are, but there are 100 Americans that have more money than entire nations. And of course, they have so much power politically, socially. And you have to wonder, whatever happened to noblesse oblige? When we have someone like Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men in the world, who has a yacht that's many stories high, I guess we could say, asking countries to dismantle their bridges so that his yacht can pass underneath it. We have some serious moral issues. We have some serious moral issues. We have a society of extreme decadence. As an American, I know that America has done a lot of good things, but this extreme wealth, it's mind-boggling. How much does one person need? Especially when that person can do so much to help others. It's really hard to understand why there's not an urge to offer more of a lending hand. And I know, Paul, that you also have a great deal of wisdom in terms of the science behind all of this. So I'd like to hear what you have to say, contributing factors to this hunger in Africa.
Yes, well, thank you, Regina, and also thank you, Peter. So a couple of weeks ago, I came across an article that said that over 14 million people in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are on the verge of starvation at the moment, and half of those people are children. Some other facts: in 2020, there were 264.2 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who were undernourished in that year, in 2020. Now, you'd think that would be the place with the most people that were undernourished, but Asia actually had more people undernourished, 418 million people. But of course, the population of Asia is 4.4 billion versus 1.2 billion in Africa. So as a percentage, it's worse in Africa. Now, when people are undernourished, especially kids, their physical, mental, emotional, intellectual development, of course, is delayed as they're growing up and turning into adults. There's also, when mothers are undernourished, there's really high infant mortality rates. And, in many of these countries, they have very unstable governments, very corrupt governments. There's a lot of conflict, both between countries and within countries. Civil wars, for example, think of Somalia. Civil war combined with droughts, of course, leads to famine. Nigeria was the Boko Haram terror. South Sudan, also, lots of conflict. And Yemen, of course, the poorhouse, if you like, of the Arab world with civil war and strife. Now, there are organizations, UN organizations like the FAO, which is the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. And in 2017, they were giving food aid to 37 countries around the world, 28 being in Africa. And for the food aid, they never have enough money to provide the food aid that is required to save people everywhere. And one of the problems is that the rich countries have pledged, money to go to countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change that had no cause of climate change. And that money pot is never enough. Those obligations are never completely met. Poverty has always been a problem in Africa. So in sub-Saharan Africa, 40 to 50% of people living there live below the poverty line, which is very, very low, the poverty line. It's basically, these people are earning less, their daily income is less than $1.25. And that's still ongoing at the moment. Now, there's many things that cause Africa to be, always in the news in terms of food and hunger and shortages, because one is the population growth of these countries is enormous, and it outstrips the growth of the food supply for these countries. You've mentioned the impact of the Ukraine war, with a lot of exports from Ukraine and Russia ending up going to Africa and not being able to go there because of the war. There's also lots of debt in these African countries, and part of that is from mismanagement of governments and corruption. But there's also diseases that have hit hard in Africa, like AIDS and malaria. And, these are all sort of making things worse there. But in terms of climate change, one positive thing in the last IPCC reports, what AR6 was the regional analysis being done. So instead of just doing it from sort of this Northern Hemisphere, Western viewpoint, they did a thorough analysis of climate change effects on different regions, and Africa, had its own section there, how climate change is affecting Africa. And of course, the biggest thing is the droughts, and long-term droughts, of course, really degrade the soil. Nothing holds the soil particles together, so any winds just blows the dust around and carries away the soils. Of course, there's an effect ongoing from La Nina, causing certain areas to be drier than others. And also something called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, which is a band that is basically, it's sort of like the heat center, it's where, the heat is equal in the Southern Hemisphere and in the Northern Hemisphere along that line, the ITCZ. It's where there's lots of updrafts. So there's lots of rainfall, lots of evaporated water goes up and comes down in rain. And when this thing actually does shift with the seasons, but it's also shifting with climate change. So it's bringing drought to regions of Africa that really haven't had too much of a problem with drought in the past. So all of these factors are combining to cause food problems in Africa that will only get worse as climate change worsens.
Thank you, Paul. And that's certainly the bad news, isn't it? And I just want to take a moment here that if you are learning something, and we hope you are, to please like the video, because it really helps YouTube get people to see these videos that we work on. Share it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. And we really, really would appreciate a comment as well. Any questions you have, we would love to help answer them. And one of the things that you said, Peter, that is, of course, a very important note is there's always money for arms. There is always money for guns, tanks. Why is that? And yet, when it comes to the very basics of what is necessary for life, out comes the begging bowl. So thank you for bringing that point up, Peter. And I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on that, or maybe talk on something tangential to that.
Well, yeah, indeed. And we've already mentioned that Africa is always in trouble, always seems to be in trouble, right? And yeah, historically that's true. But it's from what I read and what I've observed in my lifetime, that's very, very much due to the exploitation of the African continent. It's almost a sort of colonial situation that's continued. And yeah, the big money, and this particularly applies to Europe, that's been exploiting Africa. They sow seeds of corruption. And so we end up, as we've mentioned, with these governments on these countries being corrupt, and the people continually suffering under poverty and desperation. And this shouldn't be the case. Africa is a country with huge, huge resources. I remember reading a sort of futurist book 25 years ago, probably, by Alvin Toffler, called Future Shock, and it was a brilliant book. And among many things, Toffler said, "Look, Africa is going to be the age of Africa, right? Because Africa has these massive resources and a capacity for agriculture and food production, but of course it hasn't happened. Africa is being continued to be run down by these exploitive external influences." So I did want to mention that. On the regional trend that Paul mentioned, yeah, that's very interesting. And the sixth assessment has been very, very good on that. So if we look at Africa on the trends, practically all of Africa is experiencing a trend of more dangerous heat, practically the entire continent. There's just a tiny little bit in the middle somewhere, which apparently wasn't. Most of Africa is on a trend of experiencing dangerous drought. But when we look at the models in the future, they're all over the place. And it looks like Africa as a whole is going to be devastated by torrential rains and floods in the future, as well as increasing drought and heat, as Paul's already mentioned. The future of Africa, it looks very bad. And it's all very well for the United Nations organizations. They're really good. They're great. They do wonderful work. But we have a collapsed international order. That's why we've got these wars, this horrible war in Europe. Things really, really have to change. And I mean change completely. You know, there we are exploiting Africa, by the way, for fossil fuels. There's huge development, so-called, in fossil fuels in Africa. Oil, gas, coal, countries putting money into more coal power plants in Africa, doing exactly the wrong thing, So, yeah, we need a big change, folks.
You know, when you describe the fate of Africa in the future, or various fates according to models, I find it quite ironic that we're talking about the cradle of civilization and a place from which we all came, from where all life emerged, essentially, at least human life, ending. And what does that mean? What does that mean about us? And what does that mean for us? And I'm also curious, Paul, if you have any information about desertification, because I've heard that in Northern Africa, the deserts are increasing. And I'm wondering if that's true, if that is something that can also be attributed to climate change and is also leading to this continuation or increase in hunger in Africa.
Yes, the Northern Africa deserts are definitely increasing. In fact, they're crossing the Mediterranean and heading into Europe. That's contributing to the heat waves. If you look at the parts of southern Spain and other countries, they're getting more and more desertification. But, I want to reiterate some of Peter's points that the reason for weak governments and more conflicts and problems in Africa, the West, the rich countries have directly caused that by, the long history of colonialization and, slavery, pulling people from the continent to exploit them to develop, Western countries. So this has been ongoing, and one could argue that it hasn't disappeared. There's lots of farmland being bought up in Africa by the Chinese at the moment, for example. And food is grown on this land and shipped to China. It's not accessible to people that are actually growing the food. And there's also, of course, the exploitation of oil, gas, and coal. Specifically, Nigeria is one of the worst hit. There's lots of resources under the ground, lots of minerals, lots of precious metals, which are important for a renewable energy economy to make batteries and things like that. And there's lots of to access the underground treasures, if you like, the what's on the ground, whether it be forests or grasslands or whatever, is completely dug up and raised. So this is a problem. But probably the biggest problem is people don't understand how big Africa is. It's got enormous vastness, but people's knowledge of Africa is dismal. There's even some US Republicans who thought that Africa is actually one country. They don't realize it's a continent. So knowledge on Africa, on the continent, is dismal. People are all well aware of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews being killed in Europe, yet they're not aware of the roughly 20 million people that were killed in the Belgian Congo, for example. Those massacres are just people, today, ask them, they've never heard of that. Why is that? It's because it was in Africa, and it was people from Africa that were being killed. So there's still this idea of, we still as humans need to grapple with the idea that we really, it's embedded in our culture that we do not treat people equally from different countries. We don't treat humans in Africa as having the same level of humanness as we do in the West, right? So there's this racism, call it, that's probably the best thing to call it. That's what it is. But there's also, we don't value people that will be born in the future. We don't value kids and grandkids and people that are in the future. We give no value to these people. Otherwise, how could we ever destroy our planet, and give these people that are going to be born in the future sort of a hellish planet to live on, or, no hope, right? So there's these huge inequalities. And you mentioned the income inequality even in the US. We're talking about millions of people in Africa that are trying to live on $1.25 per day. And, most of that, of course, will go to trying to get food and water and shelter. And of course, if food prices double, then those people just basically, starve to death. They just can't provide, they can't survive. So this is what we're faced with right now. And of course, the huge population growth in some countries in Africa, is certainly exacerbating the issues when there's not an equivalent food supply to these people.
Well, you've pointed out, both of you, very, very complex reasons, historical background, political background for what's happening. And of course, climate change in terms of hunger and indeed even starvation in Africa. It's a very, very complex issue. And I think that's why also it gets so little attention, is because we live in a time where people, they learn by memes, right? We want a quick one-line summary of everything, and anything beyond that is just too much. But I hope that for those of you watching, for those of you who've stayed on till the end, that we have presented a summary of the situation in Africa, a continent, that helps to see it in a more holistic view. So while, of course, climate change is a huge compounder, of course, we started the show by talking about droughts and then, of course, the ensuing locusts. It's not the only thing. And of course, the very forces that have caused climate change and continue to cause climate change are indeed those forces that have exploited an entire continent. And what is that? It's greed. It's a desire for more. It's the never enough. So perhaps we hope that with this understanding, there can be an awakening. There can be awakening of enough. I have enough. I don't need to buy more clothes. I have plenty. I don't need to eat more food. I have plenty. And that if we are to live as one world, there needs to be an acknowledgement that there are others on the planet with equal value as everyone else. And we hope that we've shared that with you tonight. So once again, like, share, and subscribe, and keep on going with this hope of a better tomorrow. Thank you all very much.